As they approach the target area, the weapon is checked for the last time. At 9:11, 31,000 feet over Hiroshima, the Enola Gay begins the bomb run. At 9:15, the bomb is dropped. The aircraft banks away at high speed. Just 50 seconds later, 15 miles from ground zero, the Enola Gay is rocked by the blast.
Americans who read about Japan's surrender in August 1945 learn only part of what happened because historical accounts are incomplete. They recite the official narrative of the United States government that invading Japan would have caused 1 million American casualties. Luckily, the United States had developed the atomic bomb. After dropping 2 atomic bombs, Japan quickly surrendered. This official history fails to mention that Japan was seeking to negotiate a surrender since late 1944, after it was clear the war was lost. In a front-page article that appeared in the Chicago Tribune and Washington Times-Herald on August 19, 1945, writer Walter Trohan reported that 7 months earlier, on January 20, 1945, American President Franklin Roosevelt had received a 40-page memorandum from General Douglas MacArthur, outlining 5 separate surrender overtures from high-level Japanese officials. Admiral William Leahy, Roosevelt's chief of staff, leaked the MacArthur communication to Trohan in early 1945 for fear it would be classified as top secret for decades or even destroyed. His editors decided to hold the story until after the war ended. The authenticity of Trohan's article was never challenged by the White House. Former President Herbert Hoover personally queried General MacArthur on the Tribune story, and the general acknowledged its accuracy. The memo showed that the Japanese were offering surrender terms on January 20th, virtually identical to the ones accepted by the Americans at the formal surrender ceremony on September 2nd, 1945. See the article linked below. The United States government had found Japan's conditional surrender offer acceptable, but continued the war for several months until it could drop 2 atomic bombs to demonstrate this power to the world. There were different designs, and scientists wanted to see results based on real-world use against large cities. The United States has secretly spent billions of dollars on the Manhattan Project to build atomic bombs and wanted to justify this investment and build many more atomic bombs. During 1945, the U.S. Army Air Force conducted daily mass bombing attacks against Japanese cities. The 2 atomic bomb attacks in August produced the same destruction as previous raids involving hundreds of B-29 bombers, so they had little impact on the war or Japanese leaders, who didn't know about atomic bombs until the Americans announced it to the world. The atomic bombings did not terrify Japanese leaders as much as Soviet forces landing in northern Japan. Japan had defeated the Russians in a major 19-month war in 1905 and ceded some islands north of mainland Japan. The Soviets wanted this territory back and the northern part of the huge island of Hokkaido. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops had massed in the region. The United States had provided the Soviets with 50 Liberty transport ships to haul Lend-Lease aid, plus 149 smaller ships recently provided via the U.S. Navy's Project Hula, that also trained 12,000 Soviet sailors to operate them. This was justified by claiming Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin demanded ships in return for joining the war against Japan. See the article linked below. The Soviets launched a massive attack on Japanese forces on August 9th, quickly gaining ground in Manchuria and Korea. Japanese leaders knew these territories would be lost after a surrender, but they were terrified of Soviet forces landing in northern Japan. Japanese forces were concentrated in southern Japan to repel an expected American invasion. Soviet forces quickly overran Japan's southern Sakhalin Island, and ships appeared for amphibious landings to seize the Kuril Islands. On August 10th, Japan sent out diplomatic cables that it accepted the Potsdam Declaration and agreed to surrender Japanese military forces. It noted that Japan expected its government would remain intact, ruled by the emperor. The Potsdam Declaration didn't demand the removal of the emperor and his government. On August 12th, American President Truman formally accepted Japan's offer, but lied to the public by saying it was an unconditional surrender.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification. Arrangements are now being made for the formal signing of the surrender terms at the earliest possible moment. General Douglas MacArthur has been appointed the Supreme Allied Commander to receive the Japanese surrender. Great Britain, Russia, and China will be represented by high-ranking officers. Meantime, the Allied armed forces have been ordered to suspend offensive action. The proclamation of VJ Day must await upon the formal signing of the surrender terms by Japan.
Leaflets announcing the surrender of Japan had been prepared weeks in advance, and the daily B-29 bomber missions to Japan continued, but dropped leaflets rather than bombs. The war seemed over, yet the Americans awaited the emperor's acceptance of Truman's minor clarifications. On August 13th, someone decided to resume B-29 bombings. The 58th, 73rd, and 313th Wings of the U.S. Army Air Force on Guam were placed on standby to strike targets the next day. 729 B-29s were loaded with bombs and departed at 5 a.m. on August 14th, despite a radio broadcast from the Japanese news agency to stand by for a message from the emperor. This surrender broadcast occurred 2 hours before the B-29s reached their targets and was heard by the air crews. They expected their mission would be recalled, but heard nothing. Targets for the assault included war industries and an oil refinery at Akita. 86 American fighter planes from Iwo Jima strafed transports and communications in Nagoya, while hundreds of Allied carrier aircraft from ships offshore struck targets. The city of Kumagaya was bombed by 89 B-29, 5 days after Nagasaki was hit by the second atomic bomb. The resultant firestorm damaged 74% of the city and destroyed 40% of its buildings. Casualties included 266 civilian deaths and over 3,000 injured, or approximately 28% of the city's population. No military resistance was encountered, and no B-29s were lost. These inexplicable bombings were kept quiet until 2003, when a B-29 crewman wrote a book called The Last Mission. A detailed summary is linked below that includes a link to an official August 15, 1945 AP news story about the bombings. Slaughtering a few thousand more Japanese after a 4-day peace pause was unnecessary and cruel. The reason for this final attack was never explained, nor who ordered it. Generals later told the press that although they heard Japan's surrender broadcast, they had not received orders from higher levels to abort these bombings. The war officially ended on August 14th, pending a formal signing event. Heavy fighting continued in the north with invading Soviet forces. On August 17th, Soviet bombs fell on Japan as a large Soviet force began an amphibious invasion of the Kuril Islands. The Japanese defenders were surprised, but fought hard and bloodied the Soviet invaders. On August 23rd, Japanese generals in the Kurils agreed to surrender as Soviet forces made successive amphibious landings to secure the southern Kuril Islands by September 1st. Delaying the end of the war to demonstrate 2 atomic bombs was immoral and counterproductive. This resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands more Japanese and Americans. It allowed the Soviets to enter the war and capture northern China and northern Korea. The Soviets later transferred this territory and the massive quantity of Japanese weaponry it had captured to the Chinese Communists, helping them prevail in 1949. This also resulted in a divided Korea and the Korean War in 1950. The overall American strategy at the end of World War II was confusing and inept, leaving the world much worse off after the war. See the short videos linked below. One can only assume that the powerful business titans who sparked the war and amassed more wealth during World War II didn't want the war to end, nor a peaceful world afterwards.